The living room still smelled faintly of furniture polish and Martha's lavender candles, though she had been gone for years. Marcus Hayes, a 63-year-old black man with skin the color of dark oak and hair now silvered at the temples, carried the weight of memory every time he stepped inside. It was his house paid for with decades of long hours at the bank, overtime shifts, and sacrifices that cost him his youth. But that evening, the air had changed. His daughter Tiffany stood beside her husband, Harry Thompson, a tall white man with the kind of casual arrogance Marcus had learned to recognize early in life. Harry slouched in the recliner Marcus had once shared with Martha, a beer dangling from his pale fingers, the television flickering across his face like he owned every inch of the home. "You either serve my husband," Tiffany snapped, her voice shaking with the conviction of someone rehearsing lines, "or you get out of this house." Marcus froze. Her words cut sharper than any insult. He studied his daughter, her skin lighter than his own, her straightened hair tied back neatly, her eyes filled with something cold he didn't recognize. She had inherited his stubborn chin, but none of his loyalty. Harry smirked, his blue eyes not leaving the game on the screen. "You heard her, old man. Get me a beer and let's not make a scene." Marcus's chest tightened, not from fear, but from a familiar sting, the sting of being ordered around by someone who believed his darker skin meant he was built to serve. He had heard it at the bank from impatient customers in grocery stores, when clerks ignored him, and on sidewalks when strangers crossed the street to avoid him. But hearing it in his own home from the lips of his daughter and the man she chose was unbearable. He placed the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, slowly feeling the plastic handles bite into his palms. He had bought beer Harry's brand using his Social Security money. Not for himself, never for himself. For the man who treated him as less than family. "Excuse me." Marcus's voice was calm, steady, but beneath it ran the same fire that had carried him through years of prejudice. Harry finally looked at him, rising to his full height, looming the way men often did when they wanted to remind a black man of his place. "This is simple. You live here, you play by our rules. My rules." Tiffany stepped closer, her pale hand brushing Harry's arm as if sealing her allegiance. "Dad, don't make this difficult. Just do what Harry asks. Otherwise, maybe you should pack your things." The word struck Marcus harder than any blow. He saw in her face no trace of the little girl who once sat on his lap during thunderstorms, no trace of the daughter who used to braid his hair and call him her hero. Instead, he saw a woman who had been reshaped perhaps unconsciously by the privilege of her husband's world, a world where men like Marcus were either invisible or disposable. The silence stretched. Harry's smirk widened. Tiffany folded her arms, waiting. Finally, Marcus exhaled slowly, as if releasing decades of unspoken humiliation. He looked his daughter in the eye, then shifted his gaze to the man in the recliner. "All right," he said quietly. Harry leaned forward, smug triumph painted across his pale face. "Good. Now about that beer I'll pack." The smile slid off Harry's lips. Tiffany's mouth parted, shocked. Neither of them had expected defiance. They had expected compliance, the same quiet compliance Marcus had been conditioned to give in every white-run space he had entered since childhood. But tonight, something broke free. Without another word, Marcus turned his footsteps heavy against the hardwood floors he and Martha had refinished with their own hands 20 years earlier. He pulled his old suitcase from the closet shelf, the same one they had once carried to Yellowstone on their honeymoon. Now it would carry the remnants of his dignity out of the home he had sacrificed everything to build. Behind him, he heard Tiffany's urgent whisper, "Dad, wait!" But he didn't. For the first time in years, Marcus Hayes walked away, not as a victim of circumstance, not as the obedient father expected to serve, but as a man reclaiming his dignity in the face of betrayal and the quiet, poisonous bite of racism that had invaded his home. The motel mattress sagged beneath Marcus Hayes as he sat with his suitcase at his feet. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale smoke, nothing like the warm scent of lavender candles Martha once filled their home with. He pressed his palms against his knees, the deep brown skin wrinkled with age, calloused from decades of work no one had ever properly valued. He had built his life brick by brick, dollar by dollar. every sacrifice carved into his body, every compromise stitched into the fabric of his existence. Yet in the end, his daughter and her white husband had reduced him to a servant in the house he had purchased. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling, and let the memories flood. The bank. 35 years behind a desk, reviewing loan applications, most of them handed to white men in clean suits, who looked at him like a clerk, not a colleague. He remembered their sideways glances, the way they'd say, "Are you sure you're qualified to handle this?" Marcus, as if his skin disqualified his experience. Promotions passed him by, always with an excuse, better fit, different direction. But Marcus knew the truth. A black man could work twice as hard, know twice as much, and still be told he wasn't enough. Yet he endured. For Tiffany. For the future. He had signed overtime slips until his hands cramped, sacrificing weekends and holidays so his daughter could attend the private college she demanded. $40,000 a year, a sum that stole from his retirement. He had heard whispers from coworkers. Why doesn't she just go to state school? Why throw money away? But Marcus remembered the sting of being told he didn't belong, the humiliation of being the only black man in rooms that pretended to welcome him. He didn't want Tiffany to feel that same exclusion. Then came the wedding. $25,000 for the perfect dress, the grand reception, the flowers arranged in towering white displays that seemed to mock his brown hands as he carried them into the hall. Harry's family had offered little muttering about tight finances. Marcus had filled the gap without complaint. He wanted his daughter's day to shine, even if it dimmed his own tomorrow. And the house, $80,000 from his retirement savings for the down payment, then years of covering mortgages and utility bills whenever Tiffany called in tears. Dad, things are tight. Harry's job isn't paying enough. Marcus always said yes, because that's what fathers did, because that's what Martha would have wanted. But each check, each transfer carried a hidden cost. He remembered walking into grocery stores and noticing how clerks followed him down the aisles, their eyes sharp as though a 60-year-old black man in a suit might slip bread into his pocket. He remembered the day Tiffany came home from college embarrassed because her friends teased her about her old black dad, who looked more like a janitor than a banker. Those memories hurt more than the financial losses. They carved trenches in his heart. And now, after all the years of sacrifice, Tiffany had chosen Harry's privilege over her father's dignity. She had stood by her white husband and demanded Marcus serve him like a butler, like a subordinate, like a reminder of centuries-old scripts America had never erased. Marcus rubbed his temples. His head pounded, but beneath the ache burned a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He realized he had been financing not just Tiffany's comfort, but also her escape from the racial realities he could never escape. By covering bills, shielding her from consequences, he had allowed her to drift into a world where she could pretend color didn't matter until it came to choosing between her black father and her white husband. Now he understood. His sacrifices had bought her comfort, but they had also bought her silence. The motel's neon sign flickered through the curtains, painting the room in restless light. Marcus reached into his suitcase and pulled out a photograph of Martha, her warm smile, her eyes that never judged him for being weary. He whispered to the empty room, "I tried, Martha. Lord knows I tried. But I can't let them take my dignity, too." His phone buzzed on the nightstand, 12 missed calls. Tiffany, Harry. He ignored them. He knew what they wanted: money, compliance, silence. For the first time in decades, Marcus realized he had the power to say no, and he would. The memory returned to Marcus in sharp detail, replaying itself like a scene burned into his mind. He could still see Harry lounging in that recliner, Martha's last gift before cancer stole her away, sprawled out with the entitlement of a man who had never built anything with his own hands. Harry's pale feet were propped on the armrest, a beer bottle tilting dangerously from his fingers. The television blared, casting blue light across his face. He looked as though the world existed solely for his comfort. And Marcus, a 63-year-old black man, was nothing more than an extra in his play. "Get me another beer," Harry had said, eyes fixed on the screen. "Corona. Not that cheap stuff you drink." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had bought those Coronas himself, spent money he didn't have on a brand he never touched. He placed the grocery bags on the counter, the plastic cutting into the lines of his hands. "Harry, I just walked in. I need to put these away." The younger man finally turned his pale face set in that familiar smirk. "You're already standing. Don't make this difficult." Difficult. The word echoed like an insult Marcus had heard his whole life. Customers at the bank had called him difficult when he refused to bend the rules for their loans. Teachers had labeled him difficult when he challenged unfair treatment in classrooms where he was the only black child. Difficult was always code for not knowing his place. Harry rose slowly from the recliner, his larger frame meant to intimidate. "Look, Marcus, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. You want to keep living here, you play ball. Simple as that." The air grew heavy. Marcus could smell the alcohol on Harry's breath, could feel the weight of a century-old script pressing down on him. Here he was in the house he had worked for, being reduced to a servant by a man who had contributed nothing but arrogance. Tiffany entered, then her blonde hair pulled into a messy ponytail, a dish towel in her hand. She looked between the two men, her eyes lingering on Harry, with loyalty Marcus knew too well. "What's going on?" "Your father's being difficult," Harry said without hesitation. "I asked him for a beer. He's making it into a federal case." Tiffany's gaze slid to her father, not with sympathy, but with disappointment. "Dad, just get him the beer. It's not worth fighting over." Marcus's heart hammered. He wanted to shout to remind her that this was his home, his sweat, his mortgage payments, his sacrifices. But all he saw was her pale face hardening into a mask of indifference, aligning herself with her white husband's authority against her black father's dignity. Harry stepped closer, his voice dropping to a mocking whisper. "See how it works, Marcus. Our house, our rules. You obey or you're out." The words landed like chains. Marcus stood still, forcing his voice to remain level. "This is my house." Harry's laugh was low and bitter. "Funny. Your daughter and I live here. We pay the bills now. That makes it ours." Marcus felt the history of his people coursing through him, men and women stripped of homes, land, and legacy, always told that nothing was truly theirs. And now in his own living room, history repeated itself in the sneer of his son-in-law. Tiffany's voice cut through sharp as a blade. "Dad, enough. You need to decide right now. Either you do what Harry asks, or you can pack your things and leave." The silence afterward was suffocating. Marcus looked at her, searching for the little girl who once sat on his shoulders at parades, who once cried when children mocked her darker-skinned father. But that girl was gone. "All right," Marcus said quietly. Harry smirked, convinced he had won. "Good. Now about that beer I'll pack." The smirk collapsed. Tiffany's lips parted, her face paling as though she hadn't expected him to choose dignity over compliance. But Marcus knew he could no longer bend. That recliner, once a symbol of comfort and family, had become the throne of a usurper. And Marcus Hayes would not bow. The hallway lights flickered as Marcus pulled the suitcase down from the closet shelf. The leather was worn but sturdy, its dark brown surface scratched with the marks of journeys past. He and Martha had bought it for their honeymoon to Yellowstone, back when the world still seemed wide and promising. Now, decades later, it would carry away the fragments of his life from the home he had built with his own hands. He laid the suitcase on the bed. The quilt beneath it, stitched by Martha's fingers years ago, was frayed at the edges, but it held warmth. For a moment, Marcus pressed his dark palms against the fabric, remembering nights when Martha's laughter had filled the room, when Tiffany was a child sneaking under the covers during thunderstorms. That life felt distant, stolen. In the living room, Marcus could hear the faint hum of whispered voices, Harry's sharp tone, Tiffany's softer but complicit replies. They were plotting what to do with him as though he were a problem to be managed, not the man who had sacrificed everything for them. Marcus folded shirts with methodical precision. Socks, trousers, ties. His hands moved automatically, though his chest ached. Each piece of clothing seemed to hold memories. The navy suit he wore the day he was denied a promotion that went to a younger white colleague. The tie Tiffany had once chosen for him in high school, saying he looked just like the president. The sweater Martha had loved now, carrying only the faintest trace of her perfume. He tucked a framed photograph of Martha into the side pocket, wrapping it carefully in tissue. Her smile shone through the glass, a reminder that he was not alone, that dignity mattered more than comfort. When he slipped his medication bottles and glasses case into the bag, Marcus paused. He realized he was packing not just clothes, but his independence. For too long he had allowed himself to be tied to Tiffany's household, trapped by her demands, diminished by Harry's sneers. Now, with every folded shirt, he was reclaiming a part of himself. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as he rolled the suitcase toward the front door. The same hardwood he and Martha had refinished together 2 decades earlier, sanding and staining until it gleamed. Every plank bore the imprint of their labor, of calloused black hands shaping a home in a world that too often denied them ownership. Tiffany stood by the kitchen doorway, her pale face strained. "Dad, wait," she whispered, her voice trembling. Harry sat in the recliner again, but this time his posture was stiff alert. His eyes followed Marcus like a hawk, wary of losing control. Marcus didn't stop. He reached for the doorknob, his broad hand steady. The air was heavy with unspoken history, centuries of men like him, forced to bow, forced to obey. Tonight, he would not. The screen door creaked open, letting in the cool night air. For one heartbeat, Marcus glanced back. Tiffany's eyes met his, searching, pleading silently for him to relent. But he saw no repentance there, only fear of what his absence might mean for her comfort. "I won't live where I'm not respected," Marcus said quietly, his deep voice carrying finality. And then he stepped outside. The night wrapped around him like an embrace. The stars glimmered faintly above, indifferent witnesses to his exodus. As the door closed behind him, Marcus felt something shift inside, a weight lifting, a chain breaking. He walked to his old Buick, the faithful car that had never once betrayed him, and placed the suitcase in the trunk. The engine roared to life on the first turn of the key. He didn't look back at the house, not at the porch light flickering above the door, not at the windows where shadows shifted. That chapter was over. The road stretched ahead, dark but open. For the first time in years, Marcus Hayes was free of financial chains, free of daily humiliations, free of a household that demanded his silence in exchange for shelter. What he carried with him was not just clothing or photographs. He carried dignity, and no one, neither Tiffany nor Harry, would ever take that from him again. The Pine Lodge Motel sat at the edge of town, its peeling paint and flickering neon sign, a reminder of promises long broken. Marcus parked his old Buick beneath the buzzing light and carried his suitcase inside. The clerk at the front desk barely looked up, sliding him a key without small talk. It was nothing new. Marcus had grown used to the way strangers glanced at his dark skin, then quickly looked away as if acknowledging him too long would be uncomfortable. The room smelled faintly of bleach and cigarette smoke. A single bed pressed against the wall, a small table by the window, and curtains that never quite closed all the way. It was no home, but at least it was his. Marcus sat on the mattress edge, staring at the cracked ceiling. His mind drifted through the years, 5 of them, maybe more, of pouring his Social Security checks, his savings, his very life into Tiffany's comfort. He remembered writing tuition checks so large his hands shook. Tiffany had wanted that private college across the state. "Dad, I can't go to a state school. People will look down on me." Marcus had nodded, swallowing the sting. He knew what it felt like to be looked down on. As the only black banker in his office, he had endured decades of side glances, offhand jokes, and the unspoken message, "You are here, but you don't belong." He thought by paying for her education, she could escape that weight. Then came the wedding. The reception hall glittered. The flowers bloomed in extravagant arrangements, and Tiffany had twirled in her white dress under golden lights. Marcus had signed the checks quietly, covering what Harry's family could not. He didn't want Tiffany embarrassed, didn't want whispers about her marrying beneath her. But the irony never left him. He, the black father who carried the financial burden, had been seated in the back corner, away from the spotlight. And then the house. $80,000 from his retirement, a sacrifice he made without hesitation. Young couples need help, he had told himself. That's what fathers do. But the truth weighed heavy now. He hadn't been helping them start a life. He had been buying their acceptance, their acknowledgement, their love. And they had spent it like loose change. Marcus rubbed his temples. The motel's silence pressed in on him. For years he had justified every payment, every bill covered, every debt absorbed. It's for family, he told himself. But family had turned his sacrifices into expectations, his generosity into obligation. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, missed calls stacked one after another. He didn't need to listen. He knew the progression already. Tiffany's polite confusion, Harry's irritated demands, then the sharp shift to panic when the mortgage payment failed, when the insurance lapsed, when the credit cards were cut off. They would beg. They would blame. And eventually they would accuse him of cruelty. Marcus opened his suitcase, pulling out his leather journal. Inside pages filled with neat handwriting records of every expense, every dollar he had poured into Tiffany and Harry's lives. Mortgage payments, insurance, groceries, utilities. He flipped through the pages slowly, each line a reminder of how thoroughly he had been drained. His hands trembled as he set the journal on the table. Not from weakness, but from clarity. He had enabled their comfort at the cost of his own dignity. And worse, he had allowed their sense of entitlement to grow unchecked. Tiffany no longer saw his sacrifices as love. She saw them as duty. And Harry had twisted them into proof that Marcus was nothing more than a provider, someone to be ordered around like help. Marcus looked out the window. Beyond the parking lot, the neon sign sputtered against the night sky. He whispered to himself, his deep voice steady, despite the ache in his chest. No more. The motel room might have been small, its bed lumpy, its curtains thin. But it was his space, his decision, his dignity. For the first time in years, Marcus Hayes felt something close to freedom. Sunday morning light crept through the thin motel curtains, painting the room in pale gray. Marcus sat at the small table, his laptop open, his leather journal beside it. Papers were spread out like a battle plan, bank statements, insurance policies, credit card bills, years of sacrifice laid bare in black and white. He took a deep breath, then dialed the first number. First National Bank. "How may I help you today?" Marcus spoke calmly, his baritone steady. "I need to cancel the automatic mortgage payment for 847 Pine Street, effective immediately." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Sir, that payment has been active for 5 years. Are you sure you want to discontinue it?" "Completely sure." The representative hesitated, as if doubting that a black man could be in control of such a decision. Marcus had heard that tone before, measured, skeptical, tinged with disbelief. But he didn't waver. "The homeowners no longer qualify for my financial assistance." A few keystrokes later, the confirmation was given. Marcus wrote down the reference number neatly in his journal, underlining it twice. One tie cut. Next came the insurance company. For 3 years, his policy had covered Harry's truck and Tiffany's sedan nearly $300 a month. "Remove both vehicles," Marcus said firmly. "Today." The agent's polite surprise bled through the line, but Marcus didn't explain. He owed no justification. Then the credit cards. Tiffany was an authorized user on 3 of them, racking up charges Marcus had quietly paid each month. Now his voice was like iron. "Remove her immediately. Any future charges are unauthorized." By noon, 8 calls had been made. Each conversation ended with a confirmation number. Each confirmation number a stone in the foundation of his independence. He closed the journal and sat back, exhaling slowly. For the first time in years, the bleeding had stopped, but the silence that followed was heavy. Marcus knew what would come next. Tiffany would notice when the mortgage bounced, when the insurance lapsed, when the credit cards declined. Panic would set in. Anger would follow. He looked at his reflection in the motel mirror, dark skin lined with age eyes that carried decades of resilience. How many times had he been told to wait quietly, to accept less, to endure indignities, because that's just how things are? Too many. But today he wasn't just cutting financial ties. He was cutting the chains of obedience that had bound him to a role he no longer accepted. He thought of his ancestors, men and women, who had built homes, farms, entire towns, only to see them stripped away by laws and lies. Their sacrifices whispered through his blood. Hold the line. Don't give in. The phone buzzed again, 5 new missed calls. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. His message was already clear. Louder than words, he would no longer fund his own humiliation. The motel's silence was no longer hollow. It was powerful. It was the sound of a man reclaiming what had always been his dignity, independence, and the right to say no. By midweek, Marcus's phone was heavy with missed calls, 12, then 17, then 22. The motel room echoed with silence, but on his screen played a symphony of panic. He let them pile up before pressing play. The first few messages were polite, almost casual. Tiffany's voice calm but strained. "Dad, the bank says there's a mistake with the mortgage payment." "Can you call them?" Harry's gruff voice followed Clark. The car insurance lapsed. "Fix it. We can't drive uninsured." Marcus deleted them without hesitation. The later messages grew frantic. Tiffany's voice cracked as tears spilled into her words. "Dad, the bank wants the full amount by Friday, or they'll start foreclosure proceedings. Please, we can't lose the house." Then Harry, no longer irritated but furious, "Clark, you're making us look like deadbeats. You think this is funny? You fix this old man, or I swear Marcus hit delete." The final messages wavered between begging and manipulation. Harry tried charm that rang false. "Look, maybe I was harsh. Let's talk this out." Tiffany's tone softened, almost rehearsed. "Dad, we'll do better, I promise. Just, please help us." Marcus leaned back in the motel chair, the glow of the neon sign bleeding through the curtains, and felt a strange calm. For years he had jumped at every call answered, every cry opened his wallet at the first sign of trouble. But now he understood this was not family reaching out in love. This was dependence dressed as affection, entitlement disguised as need. He thought about the way Tiffany had looked at him in the living room, her pale features twisted with disdain as she sided with her white husband against her black father. She had chosen comfort over loyalty, privilege over respect, and now her calls carried panic not for him, but for the lifestyle they feared losing. Marcus's chest tightened, but not with regret, with clarity. His silence was not cruelty, it was justice. When the knocking came at his motel door Thursday morning, Marcus already knew who it was. Through the peephole he saw them both. Tiffany in a wrinkled sweater, eyes swollen from crying. Harry standing, rigid anger simmering just beneath the surface. He opened the door but didn't step aside. "Dad," Tiffany said softly, her voice breaking. "We need to talk." About what? Marcus asked, his dark eyes steady. Harry pushed forward. "About you trying to ruin our lives over a beer. That's what this is about, isn't it?" "A damn beer." Marcus's jaw tightened. "This isn't about beer. It's about respect. And dignity." Tiffany's hands trembled. "Dad, we can work this out, please. You can't just leave us with nothing." "You gave me an ultimatum," Marcus replied, his deep voice unshaken. "Do what Harry says, or get out. Those were your words." She flinched as though hearing them aloud for the first time. "You didn't expect me to choose dignity," Marcus continued. "But I did. And now you're living with the consequences." Harry stepped closer, his pale face flushed red. "You think you can just walk away? You owe us—" "I owe you nothing," Marcus interrupted. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of generations. "I spent 5 years paying for your education, your wedding, your house, your bills. I gave you everything. What I didn't give you was permission to treat me like a servant." The silence that followed was heavy. Tiffany's eyes filled with tears, but Marcus saw no remorse, only fear of losing security. He closed the door slowly, leaving them standing in the cold hallway. For the first time in years, Marcus Hayes felt no guilt, only freedom. Friday morning found Marcus at the diner on Main Street, the same place he and Martha used to share apple pie after her doctor's appointments. The coffee was hot, the bacon smell thick in the air, but Marcus barely tasted anything. His mind churned with the voices from the motel hallway, Tiffany's desperate pleas, Harry's clenched jaw anger. A familiar voice cut through his thoughts. "Marcus Hayes." "Well, I'll be damned." Bob Harrison stood near the counter, a white man in his late 60s, with a newspaper tucked under his arm. Marcus knew him from the bank. 15 years they had worked side by side, Bob handling commercial loans while Marcus managed personal accounts. They had shared coffee breaks, office jokes, even quiet complaints about the system that rewarded some and overlooked others. "Bob," Marcus said, standing to shake his hand. "It's been a long time." Bob slid into the booth across from him, eyeing Marcus carefully. Heard you moved out to Pine Lodge. Everything all right? Marcus hesitated. Explaining would mean peeling back layers of shame, betrayal, and the ugly truth of a daughter who chose her white husband's privilege over her father's dignity. Family situation, he said finally. Needed some space. Bob nodded slowly, then lowered his voice. That son-in-law of yours, Harry Thompson, right? He tried to pull a fast one on us at the bank a few months back. Marcus's stomach tightened. What kind of fast one? Home equity loan, Bob said grimly. $50,000. Brought in documents that claimed your house was his property. The diner noise faded. Marcus's dark hands froze around his coffee mug. My house. Yeah. At first glance, the paperwork looked official. But we ran a title search. Everything came back to you clean. No co-signers, no liens. Nothing tying him to the property. Marcus set his cup down carefully. His pulse thundered in his ears. When was this December? Maybe January, Bob said. Marcus, listen. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Those documents were forged. Marcus leaned back in the booth, the truth crashing down like ice water. Harry hadn't just been disrespectful. He hadn't just been entitled. He had been planning to steal from him, not in the heat of desperation, but with premeditation, calculated fraud dressed as paperwork. Bob's voice dropped lower. Word around town is Harry's got gambling debts, pretty substantial. He thought he could cover them with your house. Marcus's chest tightened. He thought of Tiffany, pale and loyal beside her husband, dismissing her father's dignity like it was an inconvenience. Did she know? Or had she chosen not to see, because it was easier to believe in Harry's lies than to face the truth about the man she married? Bob leaned forward. Be careful, Marcus. A man desperate enough to forge documents against his own family is a dangerous man. Marcus nodded slowly, his dark eyes steady. I appreciate you telling me this, Bob. When Bob left, Marcus sat in silence, his coffee growing cold. His reflection stared back at him in the diner window, a black man who had given everything only to be treated as expendable. The system had stolen from men like him before land, seized homes, burned deeds, rewritten. Now, history tried to repeat itself through the hands of his son-in-law. But Marcus Hayes was no longer the silent provider. He was done enabling, done covering, done being the invisible backbone of a house built on lies. He pulled his leather journal closer, flipping to a fresh page. At the top, in neat block letters, he wrote, Evidence Harry Thompson. Fraud, gambling debts, attempted theft of property. The ink dried on the paper like a promise. The Flathead County Courthouse loomed above Marcus as he climbed the wide stone steps, his suitcase of documents heavy at his side. For years he had walked into buildings like this as a banker, armed with contracts and numbers, never fear. Yet today, as a black man seeking justice against his own daughter and her white husband, he felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. Inside, the marble floors echoed beneath his steps. The clerk's office smelled of paper and ink, the air humming with bureaucracy. Marcus handed over his property deed, his name inked in bold letters, proof of decades of sacrifice, and the eviction documents he had prepared with meticulous care. The clerk, a middle-aged white woman with reading glasses balanced on her nose, scanned the papers. Mr. Hayes, you understand this is your daughter's residence? Marcus's dark eyes held steady. It's my property. They violated the terms of living there. She frowned. What terms would those be? Marcus straightened his deep voice firm. Respect. Contribution. Both broken. The woman hesitated, then stamped the documents with sharp authority. The sound cracked like a gavel. 30-day notice begins today. If they contest, there will be a hearing. Otherwise, the sheriff will serve the papers. Marcus took the stamped copies, his hand steady, even as his heart pounded. He had just crossed a line no father ever dreamed of serving legal eviction to his own daughter. But this was no longer only about family. It was about survival, dignity, and history refusing to repeat itself. As he walked back down the courthouse steps, Marcus thought of his grandparents, sharecroppers in Mississippi, who had been forced off their land by forged contracts and violent threats. They had taught him that a black man's claim to property was always vulnerable, always questioned. And now, generations later, he was standing in the same fight, protecting his home from a man who wanted to steal it with a pen instead of a whip. At the bottom of the steps, the autumn wind caught his coat. For a moment, Marcus closed his eyes and let it wash over him. He felt Martha's presence there, steady as ever, reminding him, "This is the right fight. Hold the line." Back at the motel, he spread the stamped papers across the small table, his leather journal open beside them. One page at a time, the picture was becoming clear. Harry wasn't just entitled. He was calculated, desperate, dangerous. And Tiffany, blinded by comfort and privilege, had chosen to stand with him. Marcus leaned over the papers, writing in neat letters, "Eviction filed. 30 days. Sheriff to serve notice." The motel room was silent but alive with possibility. For the first time, Marcus wasn't just reacting. He was striking back. By the end of the week, the story was everywhere. Marcus hadn't said much, just the truth when asked. But in a small town like Kalispell, truth had a way of spreading, bending, reshaping into something larger than life. At the post office, Mrs. Henderson from the church mailing committee leaned close, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Marcus, dear, I've been hearing troubling things. They say your daughter asked you to leave your own house." "Is it true?" Marcus adjusted the strap of his leather satchel, his dark skin glinting in the fluorescent light. "It's true," he said simply. Her thin eyebrows rose, her lips pursed. "But didn't you pay for her schooling, and the wedding, and the down payment on that house I did?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head slowly. "Then Lord help us, some people don't know gratitude when they see it." By afternoon, the whispers had grown louder. At Miller's Hardware, where Marcus sometimes picked up part-time work after retirement employees gathered around when he walked in. "You paid their college tuition, Dave," the assistant manager said in disbelief. "Harry's been telling everyone his family covered it." Marcus kept his voice calm, though the words burned. "Harry says a lot of things that aren't true." Tom, the owner, frowned, his pale face tightening. "Makes sense now why he never took extra shifts. We offered him overtime plenty of times, but he always had other commitments. Guess those commitments were the casino tables." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Marcus could feel the shift sympathy settling on him, suspicion turning toward Harry. But he also felt the undertone quiet but sharp, the subtle surprise that a black man had been the one funding a white family's comfort all these years. At Annie's coffee shop, conversations swirled around him like smoke. Retirees hunched over mugs muttered, "Heard Harry owes money all over town." Young mothers whispered Marcus paid their bills for years. Every word carried the weight of judgment, not just for Tiffany and Harry, but for Marcus too. Some pitied him, others respected him, and some simply couldn't reconcile the image of a dignified black man being both benefactor and victim. Later that evening, Pastor Williams invited Marcus into his office. The pastor, a white man with kind eyes, folded his hands over his desk. "Several people have come to me concerned about you, Marcus. Can you help me understand what's happening?" Marcus sat tall, his dark hands resting on his knees. "I supported my daughter and her husband for 5 years. Tuition, wedding, mortgage, bills, and last week they told me if I didn't obey his rules, I could leave my own home. So I left." The pastor's brow furrowed. "That must have been painful." "It was clarifying," Marcus said. "I won't be treated like a servant in my own house." Pastor Williams nodded slowly. "Sometimes love means allowing others to face the consequences of their choices. Perhaps this is their time." As Marcus walked home from the church, he felt the eyes of his community on him. Some nodded with respect. Others looked away, discomfort painted across their faces. In every whisper, in every glance, he felt the same tension that had haunted him his entire life, the fine line between pity and prejudice, between respect and suspicion. But one truth rose above the murmurs. People were beginning to see Harry for who he truly was. And for the first time in years, Marcus wasn't carrying the weight of silence alone. Saturday morning, Marcus walked through downtown Kalispell with the steady stride of a man who had nothing left to hide. Yet whispers followed him like shadows. He felt the shift in the air, something more poisonous than gossip. Near the bank, a small crowd gathered murmuring. In the middle stood Harry, his pale face flushed with false outrage, his voice carrying over the street. "He's lost his mind," Harry declared, gesturing dramatically. Old Marcus isn't fit to make his own decisions anymore. He's being manipulated, making reckless financial choices. It's elder abuse, plain and simple. Marcus stopped in his tracks. The word struck like venom. Elder abuse, mental incompetence. It was an old tactic, one he knew too well. When society couldn't silence a black man with chains, it tried to silence him with labels: crazy, unstable, unfit. Harry's blue eyes gleamed as he fed the crowd. He abandoned his own pregnant daughter, left her with nothing. Who does that unless he's lost touch with reality? The crowd murmured. Some nodded with concern, others looked skeptical. Marcus felt their eyes flicker between him and Harry, the white son-in-law whose voice carried privilege, and the black father whose silence could be mistaken for guilt. Marcus stepped forward. His deep baritone cut through the chatter. Pregnant. He looked straight at Tiffany, standing at Harry's side, pale and trembling. Is that what you told them? Tiffany's lips parted, but no words came. Marcus turned back to the crowd. Let me be clear. I am of sound mind. I spent 35 years as a banker in this town. I know numbers, I know contracts, I know what's mine. And I will not be painted as senile just because I refuse to bankroll a liar's debts. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Harry's face darkened. Marcus's voice grew firmer, carrying the weight of generations. This isn't about age. It isn't about memory. It's about a black man saying no to being treated like a servant in his own home, and some folks can't stand that. The crowd shifted. A few people lowered their eyes, shame creeping in. Others muttered, uncertain whom to believe. But Marcus had planted the seed. Harry tried to recover, sneering. Don't listen to him. He's bitter, vindictive. Marcus stepped closer, his tall frame steady despite the years. I can document every dollar I've spent on you, Harry. Tuition, wedding, mortgage, insurance, bills. You want to talk about manipulation? Let's talk about forged loan applications and $18,000 in gambling debt. The color drained from Harry's face. A murmur of recognition swept through the crowd. Word of his gambling had already begun to circulate, and Marcus had just confirmed it in broad daylight. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then Harry cursed under his breath and shoved his way through the onlookers, Tiffany trailing behind him with downcast eyes. Marcus exhaled slowly. The smear campaign had begun, yes, but so had the unraveling of Harry's lies. As he walked away, Marcus felt the weight of every stare, some sympathetic, some judgmental. But he also felt something new: respect. He had stood his ground, refusing to be reduced to a caricature of weakness. The truth had spoken louder than the smear. The storm broke on a clear afternoon outside First National Bank. Marcus had gone to withdraw cash when he heard the familiar grating voice echoing across the sidewalk. There he is! Harry shouted, pale face, red with fury, the senile old man who threw his own pregnant daughter into the street. A small crowd turned their eyes, darting between the two men. Marcus stood tall, his dark skin gleaming in the sun, his steady posture contrasting Harry's flailing gestures. The accusations were heavy, designed to paint him as both cruel and incompetent. Harry stepped closer, using his height to intimidate. You're a disgrace, Marcus, a man who doesn't take care of family. You're sick in the head, and everyone here knows it. The words stung, not because Marcus doubted himself, but because he recognized the tactic. He had seen it before in boardrooms and city council meetings, the way a white man's voice was given weight while his own was scrutinized, doubted, dismissed. Marcus inhaled deeply. His baritone cut through the crowd. You want to talk about disgrace, Harry? Let's talk about $18,000 in gambling debt. Let's talk about forged loan applications, with my house listed as yours. The crowd murmured, heads turning. Several people pulled out their phones, whispering as the puzzle pieces clicked into place. Harry's face twisted. You can't prove any of that. Marcus's voice sharpened. Detective Morrison can. Bob Harrison at the bank can. This whole town can once they see the evidence. You thought you could hide your lies behind my skin, behind my silence. Not anymore. The weight of his words rippled through the onlookers. They weren't just about Harry. They were about every moment Marcus had been disrespected, dismissed, or silenced because of the color of his skin. Harry lunged forward, his pale face inches from Marcus's darker one. "You think you're better than me? You think anyone here will believe you over me?" Marcus didn't flinch. His voice was calm, iron strong. "I don't need them to believe me. The truth doesn't need permission." For a heartbeat, the two men stood locked in silence, history itself, hanging between them, the arrogance of entitlement against the resilience of dignity. Finally, Harry cursed, shoving past the crowd. Tiffany trailed behind, her pale face streaked with tears, unable to meet her father's eyes. The onlookers watched in silence as Marcus adjusted his coat and walked calmly into the bank. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to chase approval. The storm had gathered, yes, but it was Harry who stood in the center of it, his lies unraveling strand by strand. And for the first time, Marcus felt the tide of history shift in his favor. Detective Jim Morrison's office smelled of old coffee and paperwork. Files were stacked high on every surface, manila folders spilling loose sheets like weary soldiers collapsing after battle. Marcus sat across from him, his dark hands folded over his leather journal. Jim leaned back, his gray eyes steady. "You've got a pattern here, Marcus. Intimidation, fraud, public slander. Combine that with the motel's security footage of Harry pacing outside your door muttering threats. We can build a case." Marcus nodded slowly. "What I need is protection. I won't live looking over my shoulder waiting for him to come crashing through the door." Jim tapped his pen against the desk. "A restraining order. We'll fast-track it. If Harry comes within 500 feet of you or your property, we arrest him on the spot." The words carried weight, legal weight. For decades, Marcus had seen how the system bent away from men with skin like his. He'd seen colleagues, overlooked neighbors, falsely accused families evicted by landlords who twisted the law to their advantage, but now for once the law was on his side. Still, a bitter taste lingered. He remembered his grandfather telling stories of Mississippi, where black men who stood their ground with paperwork instead of fists still faced retaliation. Marcus tightened his jaw. History might echo, but he would not be silenced. Jim slid the paperwork across the desk. "Sign here." Marcus took the pen, his fingers steady. Each stroke of his signature felt like carving a shield into existence. No longer would Harry hover outside his motel door. No longer would threats linger in the hallway like smoke. When it was done, Jim said, "Marcus, you've got to understand something. Harry isn't just careless. He's desperate. And desperate men with debts to the wrong people get reckless." Marcus closed his journal. "Then let him be reckless. But not with me." That afternoon, Marcus walked out of the courthouse with the stamped restraining order tucked beneath his arm. The autumn air felt crisper, sharper, almost cleansing. He paused on the courthouse steps, his dark skin warmed by the pale sunlight, and let the moment sink in. For the first time in weeks, he felt shielded, not invisible, not disposable, not a man stripped of dignity in his own home. Shielded. Back at the motel, he pinned the restraining order to the corkboard above the desk. Beside it hung the eviction notice, the forged loan documents Bob had given him, and the growing stack of evidence pages from his journal. Together, they formed a mosaic of truth, a wall against lies, a shield against entitlement. The phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "This isn't over, old man." Marcus didn't reply. He simply forwarded it to Detective Morrison and added the printout to his evidence wall. Another stone in the fortress. The motel room was quiet, but Marcus could almost hear Martha's voice in the stillness. "You're doing the right thing. Hold the line." For the first time in years, Marcus Hayes believed it. Sunday morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of St. Mark's Lutheran Church. The sanctuary hummed with anticipation. Word had spread that Tiffany might speak, though no one knew what she would say. Marcus sat 3 pews from the front, his dark hands folded tightly, his eyes fixed on the pulpit. His heart was heavy, but his back was straight. When testimony time arrived, Tiffany rose from the back row. She looked fragile, her pale skin drawn, her shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight too heavy for her. Each step down the aisle echoed like a drumbeat of doubt. At the podium, she gripped the wooden edges with trembling fingers. Her voice shook. "I need to tell you something about my father." The congregation fell silent. "For 5 years, Marcus Hayes paid for everything in my life," she began. My tuition over $160,000. My wedding $25,000. The down payment on our house. The bills when we couldn't keep up. He gave us everything while living on Social Security. Gasps rippled through the pews. People shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Marcus sat still, his face unreadable, though inside his chest tightened. Tiffany swallowed hard, her voice breaking. 3 weeks ago, when Harry demanded my father serve him like a servant in his own home, I stood by in silence. Worse, I told my father if he didn't obey, he could leave. The sanctuary seemed to hold its breath. Even the children were quiet. I sided with my husband's entitlement over my father's dignity. Tiffany continued, tears slipping down her cheeks. I betrayed the man who raised me, the man who sacrificed everything for me because I didn't want to lose my comfort. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. Hearing her confession cut deep, reopening wounds. But there was truth in her words. And truth, no matter how late, was still light. I see now what I refused to see. Then, Tiffany said, her voice gaining strength. Harry treated my father like less than family, less than a man, and I allowed it. I let privilege blind me to the respect my father deserved. I was wrong. Her pale face turned toward Marcus, her eyes red but steady. Dad, I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want to earn it. One step at a time. The congregation stirred, murmurs rising like a tide, some of sympathy, some of approval, some of shock. Pastor Williams stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. Sometimes the hardest courage is admitting our mistakes. Today, Tiffany has shown that courage, and Marcus has shown us what dignity looks like under trial. After the service, people surrounded Marcus, hands shaken, shoulders clasped, words of respect offered. Yet the only voice he heard clearly was Tiffany's, soft and hesitant, as she approached him outside. "Harry left town," she whispered. "Packed up and disappeared. I filed for divorce this morning. I want to try to rebuild Dad, if you'll let me." Marcus studied her pale face, searching for the child he once knew. For a flicker he saw her, the girl who had braided his hair with dandelions, who had laughed when he chased her through autumn leaves. "Forgiveness and trust are not the same," he said quietly. "I forgave you when I walked out that door. But trust has to be earned back, one action at a time." Tiffany nodded, her tears falling freely. "Then, let me start today." Marcus exhaled slowly, the cold morning air filling his lungs. Perhaps the crossroads was not just hers. Perhaps it was his, too. 3 months later, Marcus Hayes stood at the edge of the front yard where his life had unraveled. The house looked different now. Renovated into separate apartments, its walls repainted, its windows shining with new glass. Children's laughter rang from the backyard where a donated playground gleamed beneath the Montana sun. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, a Latina veteran just back from deployment, guided her 2 young children toward the swings. Another family, a black couple raising twins, unloaded boxes from the back of a pickup. The house was no longer Tiffany's, no longer Harry's, no longer a stage for entitlement. It was a refuge for veterans, a symbol of sacrifice honored rather than exploited. Maria approached Marcus, her hand outstretched. "Mr. Hayes, this means everything to us. A roof over our heads, a chance to start again." "Thank you." Marcus clasped her hand firmly, the dark brown of his skin against hers. His deep voice carried quiet conviction. This house should serve people who understand sacrifice, people who know what it means to give without taking. He turned toward the building, memories tugging at him. He saw Martha's smile in the living room, Tiffany's childhood toys scattered across the porch, the echoes of Sunday dinners filled with laughter. But those echoes no longer haunted him. They had been reclaimed, repurposed into something greater than his own grief. His cabin by Flathead Lake had become his sanctuary now. Small, simple, with a dock where he fished at dawn, and evenings spent reading as the sun set over the water. Life was quieter, freer. For the first time in decades, his money was his own, his dignity unchallenged, his choices respected. One afternoon, as he sat on the cabin deck with coffee steaming in his mug, his phone buzzed. A message from Tiffany Dad, 3 months into counseling. Learning a lot. Could we meet for coffee? I want to earn your trust back. Marcus looked out across the lake. An osprey dived, breaking the surface with a silver fish in its talons, rising again into the sky. He smiled faintly, typing a short reply Saturday morning at the diner. I'll be there. Her response came quickly. Thank you for not giving up on me completely. Marcus set the phone aside and closed his eyes, letting the lake breeze wash over him. He thought of the long journey from being ordered like a servant in his own home to standing in a courthouse with stamped eviction papers, to reclaiming not just a house, but his very legacy. For too long his sacrifices had been consumed without gratitude, his dignity dismissed in silence. But he had learned the difference between enabling and loving, between giving freely and being exploited. And now his legacy was no longer one of quiet suffering. It was a legacy of resilience, of justice, served, of dignity reclaimed. The sun dipped lower, painting the lake gold. In the distance, the laughter of children drifted from the veterans' housing, mixing with the cry of the osprey above. Marcus Hayes leaned back, his dark face warmed by the fading light, and whispered to the memory of Martha, "We did it. We held the line."